coming, and thank you to Castalia for inviting me to read with you. It's a great pleasure. I'm going to read one story, and sorry, Alyssa, it is fiction.
What?
Although actually, it's part of a series I've been working on, which I'm playing around with trying to figure out what it means to use poetic form in fiction. So, now, the skeleton of a whale in the Harvard Museum of Natural History. Nina stood on the museum balcony and looked down at the sperm whale's skeleton and at the whale's great lidless skull suspended above the taxidermied mammals, stiff in their splitting skins. Outside, over Cambridge, across the river, and out over Boston Harbor, clouds spattered rain. Inside, dust settled on the wooden floor, the vitrine holding 200 species of hummingbird, all these bones of old things, and her son Henry beside her, his fleshy hand on the railing. From a plaque, he read how the sperm whale had been prized especially for the waxy white substance in its case. No, not a suitcase, Mom. Henry was a great joker. The whole top of its huge square head, which was used to make the finest candles in New England and fine lubricants of all sorts, watch oil, transmission fluid, grease for lenses, and delicate high-altitude instruments. Its blubber, boiled down, ignited the street lamps of London, and ambergris from its intestine stabilized the perfumes of France. From other whales, the great curtains of baleen cut from the mouth fashioned corset stays, he read, and poked her side where a corset might have hugged her. Behind them, her father sat on a bench, tapping his cane in an indecipherable rhythm. She'd come to Boston for him, mostly, to decide what to do. He can't live alone. He refuses to do anything but live alone. At the museum entrance, they'd run into one of his former students, obsequious, shining, clearly forgotten, who had grasped her father's hands with pleasure, and Nina had thought for a second of hiring him, or someone like him. It didn't seem possible to decide what to do. She felt as if she were looking down through the seaweed-clenched water near a pier. Around her, air, no other human. She could see the whale's long, narrow bottom jaw with its 10-inch conical teeth, and its top jaw, too, its strong, naked spine, and its flippers, whose bones looked just like those in her hands. More than anything, the flipper hands convinced her the whale was indeed a mammal, more than its warm blood, more than its need to breathe air, more than its nursing of young. For 2 years or more, it nursed its young. The jaw was clear, but where was the top of the skull, she wondered? Gone, an emptiness. The day she gave birth to her son, her father had his first stroke. Is he diminished, a friend had asked. There go flukes, chimneys afire, the bloody spout of a wounded whale. Around the balcony, etchings in frames, she showed Henry pictures of men at both ends of the whaling journey, hoisting the sails, then standing inside beached whale rib cages that soared around them like cathedral doorways. Boys not much older than he peeled off the sheets of blubber in a spiral like ton-weight skins of orange, and the whale's carcass turned and turned until it dropped into the sea. The strokes kept coming. Each time she'd been fooled into thinking that her father would recover. Instead, he'd slipped further away until the cumulative effect was a silence cleansed of memory and all but the simplest language. My turkey, he said after the most recent stroke, motioning to shave himself. In the center of his brain now, one would find a puddle of blood. Next, pictures of all hands on deck, ready to lower the whaleboats, a boat steerer with his harpoon at the ready. Sometimes the whalers would wound a calf, knowing its blood would bring the mother round. The clicks with which cow and calf called each other, a sort of song, could stun a man underwater. The sound not a sound at all, but a knock to the chest. You fools, Nina thought. You thought your fate was separate from the fate of the whale. I'll bring Grandpa over, Henry said. He went and extended his hand. She watched the anger rise like a wave in her father's face. I won't, he said. I won't, and raised his cane, waving it so that her son backed away. You better do something about that boy, her father called after, then uttered a series of curses loud enough to echo. Yeah, Mr. No Memory, Henry muttered. The day before, he'd made faces behind her father's back, mimicked his halting speech, and stuck his foot out, right where her father's cane was heading. She'd seen the scared look in her father's watery blue eyes. And then the day before that, it had been her father's cane sticking out at the top of the stairs, right where Henry was heading. They made a fine pair. You go to him, Mom. Oh, there have been times she wanted to do the same, stick her foot right out, and times she was the foot, stuck everywhere. At home, she and Henry had left plants unwatered, clean clothes in a messy pile, a cat the neighbors had promised to feed. All these would need tending to. No, she said. No, he's fine there. He's perfectly happy. Let him just sit there. She smiled at her father and waved stupidly. Sometimes the whalemen slipped in blood and oil on the ship's deck and slid into the ocean for sharks to eat. Sometimes a hand might reach for them. Behold them in the gathering dusk, with a whale roped to either side of the ship. My father's already gone, she thought, left this land for sea. Then, sing, she demanded, kneeling before him. Teach my son to whistle, damn it. And her father pursed his lips, but she didn't think it was in a whistling shape. Was he trying? Was he making fun? He'd been a great tease, the snowballs just missing her face. In the car up from New York, she and Henry had been singing a lot of sea shanties. Heave away, haul away, they sang, and farewell to Nova Scotia, ye sea-bound coast. May your mountains dark and dreary be. But when she asked her father to sing one of the old ones for her, Shenandoah or Deep Blue Sea, he couldn't remember them, although he'd sung their refrains to her maybe 1,000,000 times. Oh, you pinks and posies, go down, you blood red roses, go down, she sang instead. After they'd been thrice around the balcony, learning about the killing and processing of whales, she took Henry's hand and left her father behind, sitting on the bench. Her little white-haired father with his dapper white goatee, his cheeks as soft as a series of cliches. Her son played with her fingers, although he hadn't let her hold his hand since he was 6, and they went outside, and a feeling of buoyancy overtook her. Henry began to sing, first softly and then loudly, since they weren't in the museum anymore. All for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. I spent all me tin on the lassies drinking gin, and it's o'er the western oceans I must wander. And she laughed and laughed to hear her 11-year-old sing that with such feeling. And he laughed too, because he knew it was funny, that jokester. Blood was thicker, they always said, but maybe it wasn't, or maybe only some blood. She turned to Henry and watched his face as he stepped into the light, a curtain lifting, and they walked away. Causes of death: food poisoning, massive waves, illness, fighting, infected wounds, whales, the ice-cold sea. Later, years later, long after her father is dead and she has tossed his ashes into the ocean off Maine, she will think back on this afternoon and her stomach will turn again and again, like the phrase in the song. She can't let go of it. How monstrous she'd been, how foolish, how she left her father there on the dusty bench, his hands clutching the cane and his mouth waiting to smile again at their return, at these two faces he still recognized. Because she has seen the skeleton again and realized that the top of its skull is there, the sleigh, the chariot, the coach, the whalemen called it, a small space for the brain to tuck inside. The skull houses the brain, and the brain its secrets, even her father's brain, perhaps, though his eyes were dim and liquid. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to our readers, Nicole, Jess, Matthew, Scott. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll see you on Tuesday, March 3rd.